So I guess when I was thinking about this with the title that I was given, I didn't quite know exactly at first what to do with it, but I figured there's probably quite a lot of people who have done some philosophy in the academy before, and some people who haven't, and some people who have done a little bit more of Jewish texts, and some people who haven't, so I wasn't quite sure exactly how to balance it. So the sources that are on your sheet are a kind of good mix of basically just basic stuff, and I'm just sort of want to blend them together and give some more shape to the question that is the title, what is philosophy or what is Jewish philosophy? Because it's philosophy is kind of a funny word if you think about it, or at least the way that we use it now. So I actually, before coming over here, I Googled, you know how Google shows recommends you certain searches? So I Googled philosophy of, and it comes up with a bunch of stuff. And there's some things on there like philosophy of education and philosophy of science that if you went to any sort of ordinary academic philosophy department, the people who are employed there would say yeah, that's a proper object of philosophy. And then there are other sorts of things like philosophy of business or philosophy of nursing or something like that, not to disparage nurses or businessmen or anything like that. Very noble professions, but aren't usually associated with philosophy. So I think part of the way that we use philosophy these days is sort of as what do you think of as the basic theoretical background for the way something operates, or what is your approach to doing something? And I think at least in the philosophical tradition proper and in the Jewish tradition proper, philosophy has a little bit more narrow of a meaning. And so what I wanted to do is basically two things. The first is to sort of investigate what that meaning is historically of that narrow conception of philosophy, and why it's actually, for a lot of reasons, been viewed to be sort of antithetical to Judaism, or at odds with Judaism, and why it shouldn't be tolerated, or at least limited in its engagement with Judaism. And then toward the end, to sort of move us towards how we might actually recover an authentically Jewish kind of philosophy, or reason for studying philosophy, or something like that. So the first story, or the first source, is from Masechet Shabbat. It's a somewhat famous story, I think, or at least it's produced quite a bit of scholarship from what I can tell, and most of the scholarship has presumed that the judge in the story is actually a Christian because of some of the things that he says later. And actually, Rav Schachter recently mentioned this Gemara and just flat out called the judge a Christian, which we will see in a second is not quite accurate. So I think it's not quite accurate, or at least I want to pin that claim to a very specific word that's used here. So if someone wants to read the first paragraph, does anyone want to volunteer? English, preferably.
Ima Shalom, the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, was Rabban Gamliel's sister. There was a philosopher in their neighborhood who disseminated about himself the reputation that he does not accept bribes. They wanted to mock him and reveal his true nature. She privately gave him a golden lamp, and she and her brother came before him, approaching him as if they were seeking judgment. She said to the philosopher, "I want to share in the inheritance of my father's estate." He said to them, "Divide it." Rabban Gamliel said to him, "It is written in our Torah, in a situation where there is a son, the daughter does not inherit." The philosopher said to him, "Since the day you were exiled from your land, the Torah of Moses was taken away, and the Avon Gilyon was given in its place. It is written in the Avon Gilyon, a son and daughter shall inherit alike."
So a couple of things here. So I think, based on Jeff's face, there's good reason to think that he might be a Christian based on a son and a daughter shall inherit alike is from the Gospels. The Avon Gilyon here is a play on words meant to be a sort of serious recurring sin, but it's a joke on the Greek evangelion, which is translated to gospel. So the evangelist comes from, it means the good tidings, bringer of good tidings, which is gospel in Old English. So it's a joke about sinning and evangelism. But I think the most important thing, or at least to not take the step into just saying he's a Christian, is that he's called a philosopher here. So maybe he's a Christian philosopher. It's sort of unclear exactly what philosopher is called here, but there's definitely an association with a philosopher being someone who is not exactly a straight shooter. So let's go to this, and we'll see why in a second.
I don't see those sources, so I don't feel as bad interjecting here, but the fact that a heretic is called Epicurus
Yeah, absolutely. So, but then why is he just not called? Sorry, so Rashi actually comments on this and just says that he's a mean. So he is a heretic of some sort.
Which, in the original meaning.
Sure, absolutely right. So it's definitely possible. I'm just trying to hang this on one word and say like, well, we should sort of not rush to conclusions. Just take it at face value.
I mean, are you going to present a rebuttal, or do you just not see sufficient evidence?
I mean, I don't see sufficient evidence for saying with certitude that he is a Christian and not a philosopher, whatever that might mean. I don't think this Gemara is making a specific claim about what the definition of a philosopher is, just sort of like what someone who would be called a philosopher might do. And that there's just a lesson to learn from that. I mean, I think it's somewhat irrelevant here. Definitely this is a diatribe against Christianity for sure, but it also might be indicative of something else as well. And that I'm sort of not interested in the Christian part of it and interested in what else it might tell us. So I don't think that's necessarily wrong. And there are lots of reasons to think that this has some sort of, that this Philosopha has some sort of association with Christianity, but it's hard to say how much, and so I just want to sort of bracket that question at least for today. So would someone read the next paragraph? Vinny?
The next day, Rabban Gamliel brought the philosopher a Libyan donkey. Afterward, Rabban Gamliel and his sister came before the philosopher in judgment. He said to them, I proceeded to the end of the Evangelion, and it is written, I, Evangelion, did not come to subtract from the Torah of Moses, I did not come to add to the Torah of Moses. And it is written there, in a situation where there is a son, the daughter does not inherit. She said to him, may your light shine like a lamp, alluding to the lamp which he had given. Rabban Gamliel said to him, the donkey came and kicked the lamp, thereby revealing the entire episode.
So it's kind of a funny story, right? So you have what? Yeah, it's the story has a lot of layers, but I guess what I sort of initially just want to bring out of it is that you have someone who's called a philosopher, basically, and what he ends up doing is being corrupt and distorting the Torah and being confused about all of these later sources that might be irrelevant or irrelevant to the Torah. And he concedes that he hasn't actually read what he's, in full at least, what he's citing and using as proof. So you have some kind of evidence here that a philosopher is some sort of like troublemaker, not really a trustworthy person, someone who's not someone you can rely upon to like have a stable society, or at least put into power if you want to have a stable society. And what's something, Jeff, I think that's interesting about the Christian aspect is that some of the indications about it are the actual characters. Rabbi Eliezer is accused elsewhere, I think, of converting to Christianity, and there's a Christian tradition of. No, I think both actually. So I think in the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer is accused, and there's a Christian tradition, although not a Jewish tradition, of Rabban Gamliel converting to Christianity.
But Rabban Gamliel definitely appears in the New Testament. So.
Yes, right. So there are a lot of layers to the story. I just mean to say that the central figure of the story is not a trustworthy character, and I don't think it's an accident that he has the moniker of a philosopher. So we can move on to the second source, which I think goes in the same direction. So the Apology is sort of a very foundational Platonic dialogue. Socrates is usually the main character of Plato's dialogues, and the sort of most famous thing that happens to Socrates is he's an Athenian citizen, he's accused by his fellow citizens of a lot of severe crimes, and the Apology is a record, an approximation, a dramatization of his defense speech. So an apologia is a defense speech, and so it's a record, sort of of his defense speech. And so this is something that I think is very interesting from his defense speech. Socrates says, "My earlier accusers got hold of most of you from childhood, persuaded you and accused me quite falsely, saying that there's a man called Socrates, a wise man, a student of all things in the sky and below the earth. Those who spread the rumor, gentlemen, are my dangerous accusers, for their hearers believe that those who study these things do not even believe in the gods." So here we have some sort of indication from a non-Jewish source that what philosophy does is talk about things or inquire about things that probably shouldn't be inquired about. And that the result of that might be not believing in the gods, which in ancient Athens was a capital crime. Heresy was a capital crime, impiety was a capital crime. And so Socrates was charged with other things, of course, for which he was probably guilty, but he was eventually put to death. But this is his defense piece, saying he denies that he's investigating these things, and that's his basic defense, at least on this charge. But there's some other indications that there's a not that he was doing this literally, but there's a play called The Clouds written by Aristophanes, which depicts Socrates as being in like a hot air balloon, and he's sort of like philosophizing in this hot air balloon, which sort of resonates with the investigating things in the sky type thing. And so I don't know if there's actually an historical connection between that sort of language and the next source, but I think the next source actually resonates with it quite well. So if someone wants to read it, I don't know why the Aramaic turned out in gray, if you have that on your sheet, but if someone wants, it's only a few lines, so.
Whoever looks at four things, it would have been better that he had not come into the world. What is above, what is below, what is before creation, what is after creation.
Right, so the basic gist, so this actually occurs in a chapter of Chagiga about what kind of Torah you can teach to people and when, under what circumstances. So there are certain rules about teaching the Arayot in a certain community, or this teaching called Maaseh Merkava, which is supposed to be like sort of divine science. You're not supposed to teach it to groups of 2 or more, or something like that. And so the basic idea of this Mishnah actually is that there are some things that you shouldn't talk about, or you shouldn't talk about so publicly, or that you shouldn't, in this one, that you shouldn't talk about at all, that those kinds of questions lead to answers that are going to be unsatisfying or dangerous or a problem, and that it actually might be better that you weren't born if you're going to ask them. So, but what I think the juxtaposition is interesting, because at least we have lamala lamata, right? Like what's above and what's below, which is what Socrates is also talking. Obviously, it's a kind of metaphor for God, what's in heaven and what's under the earth, which for a lot of these people was not the core of the earth or something, but some kind of vast body of water. It's unclear sort of, so like some of these cosmological views are that the earth sort of floats on this vast ocean, and then once you get towards the edges of the earth, that's where the ocean is on the surface, but it's unclear sort of like what's beneath us, whether it's some sort of hell or something like that.
Turtles.
So, what?
Turtles,
yeah. So, and then this, the next source is from Yehuda Halevi's Kuzari, which I think is a very good source, because most people usually think of it as a sort of exemplary source in Jewish philosophy. Usually Halevi's called he's either a poet, obviously he wrote a lot of poetry, or a philosopher, because he wrote this huge work, the Kuzari, which is supposed to be a defense of Judaism, and peddles and sort of arguments that we would typically think of as philosophers peddling in. But this is from actually the very opening, a few paragraphs down. It's quite long, but I think it's worth reading. So that's why I put all of it. If someone wants to read, Ellie.
The philosopher said to him in Arabic, or the philosopher said to him, "There is no being pleased and no feeling hatred with respect to God, because he may be exalted with beyond desires and aims. The reason is that having an aim indicates that there is a deficiency in the one who has it, while achieving one's aim is perfection for him who does so. But as it remains unfulfilled, as a deficiency. Likewise, according to the philosophers, he is beyond the knowledge of particulars because they change with the times, whereas there is no change in God's knowledge. Therefore, he is not aware of you, let alone of your intentions and your actions, nor does he hear your prayers or observe your movements. In fact, he did not create man at all, because the world is eternal with respect to the past, and man has never ceased coming into being out of the man before him. Pursue knowledge of the true realities of things, so that your intellect may become active and not passive. Keep to the paths that are most just in regard to both character traits and actions, because it helps one to conceive of that which is true, to persevere in study. Once you can be described by this kind of belief, you will not be concerned about what kind of law you observe or profess or revere, or what kind of speech, language, or actions you employ. Or else, create a religion for yourself for the sake of cultivating submissiveness, reverence, and praise, and also for governing your character traits, your home and your city, if you are accepted by them.
So what is the philosopher saying here?
It seems like he's saying something against philosophy. Stick to the straight and narrow.
What do you mean?
Don't bother. He's trying to say, don't bother with these things. Just
Yeah, so I think this is a very different view of philosophy from the prior sources. The prior sources are mostly about questioning things or being sort of inconsistent. And what this philosopher is saying here seems to be a lot more doctrinal. He seems to have more of an idea of what his positive beliefs are instead of a sort of method or disposition to doubt something that's received. But what are some of the specific things that he's claiming here? So the context of this is that the Kuzari starts with this king, the Khazar, who has these dreams that God wants him to do something and he doesn't know what those things are. And so he's going to consult with a lot of people to see what they think he should do. And this is what I should have said this before, but this is what the philosopher is telling him he should be doing with his life. And eventually he'll dismiss the philosopher and he'll go on to a Christian, he'll go on to a Muslim, and he'll dismiss them as well. And then he'll get to a Jewish scholar, and then there's 300 pages of the Jewish scholar convincing him that Judaism is correct. So, but I think this is at least very interesting for our purposes. So what specifically is he claiming?
It's the king of the Khazars comes and says, I have this dream where God is telling me, your motivation's very good, but you're doing the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
And the philosopher tells him, God actually doesn't care about what you do.
Yeah.
So he's being very...
Not only does God not care about what you do, he's like incapable of caring about what you do.
He doesn't matter to any... Right.
Yeah.
So
and you should even create your own religion if you find that to be helpful. It's just...
Right, but it's all... Yeah, it's not what's really important. And it's just so... He's just not responding to the question, right? I mean, it's sort of the premise of the Khazar king. He's saying, well, this is what God tells me. And the philosopher says, no, God doesn't tell you that, or God can't tell you that, or right? It's...
Well, he is sort of saying you should spend your life in contemplation.
Right.
But
the dream that he's dismissing, the dream was, God is telling me you have to figure out what your actions are wrong. And then he said, well, no, that's not so.
Right. So
he's obtuse to the actual, the person in front of him who has this need for guidance. The philosopher is kind of dismissing the premise of the...
Right. So I think here that Rabbi Walkenfeld's essentially right, that what he's doing is he's setting out... Halevi, for one, is putting out all these things so that he can immediately reject them once the rabbi gets on the scene, because most of these things, authentic Judaism thinks are just theologically wrong, right? Like, God cares about what you do, and he punishes you for those things, and he cares about how you treat other people, not because it helps you, conceive of what is true, but because you have an obligation to treat other people how they're supposed to be treated, not for some sort of selfish reason. That the universe is eternal, and that's something that from the very start of Bereshit we think is wrong. So part of the idea here is to set up philosophy as being directly antithetical to Judaism, whereas Islam and Christianity are not, because they, in the dialogue, and nominally presume certain truths that Judaism also claims. But what's curious here is that the philosopher is actually he's a caricature of Aristotelian philosophy, right? So during from Greece to Rome and onward up until the Middle Ages, Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy starts to boom and starts to become like a real philosophic school in certain ways. And obviously, certain people have access to different sources. And so I don't think Halevi actually had much access to Plato. So what he's really talking about are Aristotelians here. But these are claims that... Sorry?
Can you explain what that means?
So Plato and Aristotle are two philosophers from ancient Greece. Aristotle is the student of Plato.
What's the difference between Plato?
There's a lot of overlap, but some of the basic differences are that Plato's Plato writes only dialogues, or at least we only have dialogues, and Aristotle writes tractates. So there's more written in Aristotle's name that we can actually attribute to Aristotle than we can to actually Plato's beliefs, because he's talking in lots of other people's tongues. But some sort of philosophic differences about the ideas that are differently expressed is that Plato believes in these things called forms, or people think that Plato believes in these things called forms because there are these characters who elaborate on this theory, which is that, you have a form of justice, or a form of the good, or a form of the beautiful, and that different things in the world participate in these forms. And so you have like Mahler's fourth, which is very beautiful, but it's imperfectly beautiful because it's not actually the form of the good. It just sort of participates in it and draws on it, and that's that accounts for its beauty. Whereas Aristotle explicitly writes against the theory of the forms and has these other sort of views of ethics, but doubles down on a lot of sort of more metaphysical claims than Plato does. So one of those is that the universe is eternal. He believes in God, as we're going to see later in the last source, but his view of what God is very different from what we would say God is. And so that sort of idea starts to influence later thinkers, and so it sort of solidifies into a kind of school that you would call Aristotelianism, and then later Neoplatonism, and there's a lot of back and forth because they share a lot of ideas, and they're coming very much so they're coming from exactly the same place at almost exactly the same time, but that doesn't mean they have exactly the same ideas. So that's a very big question. Did that help to okay, hopefully a little bit. So in a certain way, what Halevi is talking about here is a very specific school of philosophy, which he associates with just philosophy because that's basically all they have at the time. And so I think the idea here is that philosophy is not only in method, but in doctrine antithetical to Judaism. It has to be refuted, right? Or maybe not tolerated, perhaps. Mm-hmm. So we could go on to the next source, which I just threw in because I thought it was pretty acerbic and direct. And Spinoza, as Dr. Wallenberg can tell you about, is a Portuguese Jew who goes with his family to Amsterdam. He's born in Amsterdam. Okay, he's born in Amsterdam to the Sephardic community, and he ends up reading books that he shouldn't have read and doing things that he shouldn't have done, but we're sort of unclear about what those things are. So he's excommunicated from the Jewish community in Amsterdam, and he starts writing all of this philosophy. And I thought this was an especially acerbic line, but this is a chapter where he's talking about the Christian apostles and sort of what they're doing. And at first he says, Paul is the most philosophical of the apostles because he has to, his main task is to go out and convert the Gentiles. And the Gentiles are Greeks and Romans who are, at that point, around the turn of the millennium, pretty well versed in Greek philosophy because Plato and Aristotle have essentially become a pretty standard educational source for people of the day. And so you have to, if philosophy is influencing the way people think, you have to address that. Whereas the other apostles, the not Pauls, I'm not really well versed in the early church history, but these people existed, who were preaching to Jews, trying to convert Jews to Christianity. The Jews who were despisers of philosophy, they adapted themselves to the Jews' unphilosophic minds. So this is just like a nice little quip, but I thought that Spinoza, having grown up in a Jewish setting and growing up with a real view of actually what Judaism is, not sort of a caricature of Judaism through Christian sources or other sources, and being a philosopher himself might have something salient to say about this. So I don't think there's much to talk about here. I just thought it was a reason to bolster my point, which is from these sources that philosophy and Judaism don't obviously go that well together, or at least many people didn't think that they went so well together. So we can sort of think of why some of these ideas we might not want to be talked about from the Bima, or at least not appropriately talked about from the Bima. They don't sort of like have a home in Judaism. It would be sort of uncomfortable if someone got up here on Shabbat and started arguing for the eternity of the world. It wouldn't quite be the right venue. So the question is from these sources, what exactly is philosophy? Does philosophy necessarily have to question the creation of the world? Does philosophy have to question whether you should act appropriately towards people because they deserve it, or because it's good for you? Or should we take some of these basic tenets of Judaism and not question them? Which one sort of takes precedent, and which one has the burden of proof on it to justify its own point of view? So the next source is the first mitzvah aseh from the Mishnah Torah. And I actually once heard a very good shir about this from Leon Wieseltier. And so basically the mitzvah is just, you're supposed to know that there's a God, because the first thing in the Aseret Dibrot is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? I'm the Lord your God. So something curious about this is it seems kind of obvious, right? Okay, so is the mitzvah just knowing that there's a God, sort of what does that mean? Right? What do you guys think it means? What does it mean to know that there is a God? Why is it a loaded question? What do you mean?
What does it mean to know?
Yeah, that's not exactly what I had in mind. I mean, let's just say that knowledge is justified true belief or something basic like that.
Let's say.
That's a fairly like,
Justified true belief, so that he's saying he needs to know the proofs,
okay,
because it needs to be justified.
sure.
And yet he continues by.
So, but justification doesn't necessarily have to be proof. It could be evidence, right? If you were physically there at Har Sinai and you saw the clouds and the thunder and heard the voice, that wouldn't be a proof, but it might be real, incontrovertible evidence about something. So
you creating a God equals a chair, for example. How do you know a chair exists?
Right.
That's how you should
Right.
know God exists.
right.
And whatever
Are we
mechanism.
trying to distinguish between evidence and proof as one is a posteriori and one is a priori?
Sure. I mean, what I'm trying to go towards is if I say, like, you have a mitzvah to know that Rabbi Wachenfeld is sitting here, right? Like, is the mitzvah to know that Rabbi Wachenfeld is sitting here, or to know that Rabbi Wachenfeld is sitting here, right? It could be both, right? You have to know what knowing is, and you have to know what Rabbi Wachenfeld is. What I think is curious about this is the next few mitzvot that Rambam talks about are qualities of God, right? You can't really, that he's one, that he's all powerful, that he's all knowing, all these sorts of things. And I think what he's trying to get at is like, look, you can't really say that you know that God exists unless you sort of know some basic things about God, right? Could we say that you're yotzei the mitzvah if you think that God has 3 parts, or something like that?
Or has a long white beard.
Or has a long white beard?
Now you can define God in a certain way, and we all know it.
Right, but maybe that's not God, right? If I say that Rabbi Wachenfeld has to be a thing who's wearing a blue shirt right now, then this man sitting here wouldn't fit the definition, right? So I think part of the question is what is a God? Who is God? Yeah, Josh?
Is there any significance in using the word yada, like to dot something as opposed to like emunah? Like a lot of times we would associate like you believe in God
Right.
versus I know there is a God. Is there
I think
significance to that?
I think Rambam would say, yeah. I think absolutely. You have I think what he's getting onto here is you have an obligation to know for certain, based on certain evidence or proofs, arguments, justifications, whatever, that God is and that he is a certain way. And if he weren't that way, then he just wouldn't be God, or he'd be some sort of corrupted conception of God, and that you wouldn't have actually understood the proper thing. So if you think maybe there's one God, but he really is like a big man in the sky, in chariot riding around, throwing around lightning bolts or something like that with his very powerful buff arm, and you think it's okay to worship that image, you're doing something very wrong, I think, in Judaism's eyes. Definitely in Rambam's eyes. Right? Ali?
So, Moshe Halbertal, in his book Idolatry, has a long discussion about this. And he basically raised the question between the Kuzari and the Rambam about what does it mean to know God? Is it that you know what he is, what he looks like, or is it simply just to know God through the tradition that we have? And he compares that to a famous focus between Saul Kripke and Bertrand Russell about proper names and how do they work. So Bertrand Russell says a name is simply just something that you use as a placeholder for the denotation of something that absolutely means something else, right?
Right.
So for the Rambam, you're like, you don't know who God is if he has wings and he flies around a chariot, right? But for Kuzari, he'd say, so you messed up a little bit in what he looks like. But you know God because your father, he's the God of your forefathers.
Right.
He's the God who your father told you about, and your rabbi told you about, and he's part of that tradition. You're part of that tradition. So to know God means to be part of that tradition. You may know some things, you may think some things about it are not true. Doesn't mean you don't know that to God through the tradition.
Right. So I think it's an open question. And this is something that people talk a lot about nowadays, especially in the kind of multi-religious society we have. Do Christians, Jews, and Muslims all believe in the same God?
And so
well,
some people would say Christians don't,
yeah.
Muslims do because of the
Right.
part.
All of them agree nominally that there's one God. Is that enough?
Right.
All of them agree that he gave the Torah to Moshe at Mount Sinai. Is that enough? Not all of them agree that God became man. Not all of them agree that God broke or superseded a covenant with Noah to make a covenant with all of mankind later. So I don't know, it's an open question, but I think what Rambam is getting at here, and he talks about this later in More Nevuchim, is that there are certain things you have to know about God, right? That you're, as a Jew, you're just obligated to know about God. You're obligated to know. He's, I think, pretty emphatic about, although he's in a minority on this question, that you're obligated to know that God doesn't have a body, right? But there are other things you don't have to know about God, right? Like the prophet knows more about God. Moshe Rabbeinu knows more about God than anyone in this room, and that's okay. We shouldn't think of ourselves as violating some halacha just because we don't know as much about God as Moshe Rabbeinu does.
But the use of the word knowledge does imply something kind of like philosophy. Because says,
Yeah.
You have to believe in God.
Yeah.
Okay, there's something philosophical about
Yeah.
it. But to know is beyond just, well, I heard it, so I'm continuing to believe it.
Right.
It's kind of knowledge.
Right. It's not simply hearsay. And I think, going back to the shir that Leon Wieseltier gave, he thinks that he reads Maimonides here saying, you have to know the proofs, right? I don't know if there's enough evidence from this or from the rest of the Mishnah. Leon Wieseltier is a very brilliant man, in my eyes at least, and knows a lot more Rambam than I do, so I will defer to him on this question. But I think that's an open possibility. That's an open way to read this and to read the following sections of the Mishnah Torah and the rest of Rambam.
I was taught that by Professor Sefcovic, who knows even more Rambam than Weasels here. That this means the
Exactly
mitzvah is to philosophically demonstrate, to logically prove the existence of God.
Right. So, when are we getting the proofs?
What?
When are you presenting the proofs soon?
Next week.
Okay. So I wanted to include some bits from Breshit and Shemot, but I thought you guys would know them, so I didn't put them on, and I wanted it to be 2 pages. So the next source is Leon Kass's book about Genesis, and he's talking about the episode right before Sodom in Amorah when Avram Avinu is talking, he's visited by the angels and he feeds them and then sends them off, and then God comes to him and says, I'm going to destroy these 2 cities, and here's why. And then Avraham questions him and says, is the judge of the earth, isn't he supposed to deal justly? And Kass points out actually right before this paragraph, that God says to Avraham, I'm going to destroy these 2 cities. And then Avram Avinu only talks about 1 city, and then the only city that's mentioned afterwards is Sodom, where his nephew lives. And so that Avraham's questions to God might not be completely dispassionate, that he's not really interested in Gomorrah, he's only interested in Sodom, which I think is an interesting question. But at the very least, here what we have is, I don't know, does someone want to read the Kass paragraph?
Yet lurking in these personal concerns are also larger and even more important questions critical to Abraham's relationship to God and his founding mission. For Abraham desperately needs to know whether divine justice bears a sufficiently close resemblance to our human intuition about justice, namely that the good shall prosper and only the wicked shall suffer. Is God's justice seen from this human viewpoint arbitrary and capricious? If so, will it be possible to follow him wholeheartedly as God commanded? For this reason especially, Abraham insists on learning whether the righteous must suffer with the wicked.
Right. So what's going on here?
Seems to think that Abraham is testing God.
Yeah. Right. So I think something that Kass might think is that if God doesn't give Abraham a good answer, then maybe Abraham doesn't owe as much to God as he previously thought.
But despite it all, Abraham still believes in God.
Yeah.
Even though he didn't get the answer that he expected the first time. Or
The first time, yeah. God does back down. So is this, I think there may be two options here. We could read the story, and this wouldn't be the Cassian way of reading it. Cassian? The Cassian way of reading it would be, is this a sort of mashal about Abraham coming to knowledge of God, or is God changing in some sort of way because of Abraham's argument?
Meaning, is Avram convincing God in
Yeah.
the negotiations, or are the negotiations just revealing God's mercy that was there already or something,
Yeah.
and Avram has to uncover it through his negotiation?
Where is this instruction? I mean, is this God's way of teaching Abraham? Engagement.
Right, it could be the case that God's initial offer, so to speak, I mean, he's not really offering because he's God, but his initial offer is not serious. That he's just seeing how Abraham is going to react. That's also a third option.
I mean, there are other times that God changes his
Yeah.
mind. So
Right. I think in either case, what you have here is there has to be some kind of striving toward knowledge of God in some kind of way, right? Either God is just, and our intuitions that he isn't just from the start need to be corrected through some sort of inquiry or questioning, or there's something to which God needs to be held accountable, and we need to put God in juxtaposition to that standard, right? And evaluate things from there.
Also that Abraham feels the dialogue between Abraham and God is such that number one, you just have to, you know from that he believes in a God, or else he's having that dialogue.
Yeah.
So, and it also shows that Abraham feels the kind of God that Abraham envisions is a God that you can reason with.
Right. If it's a question of, if it's true that God is changing in the story, if he's changing what his sincere plan of action is, then yeah. But it's possible that God doesn't change. It's even perhaps, I mean, our sort of initial interactions with the world suggest, at least for people who believe in God, that there are things that happen that are unjust and awful, that God has control over, and we can't reconcile those occurrences with a just God. Mm-hmm.
A simpler reading might be just that God's doing Abraham a favor. It's like both things would be just like, oh, Abraham asked for it, so okay.
How could both things be just?
Why not? I mean, why do you have to only one?
Because it's a question of punishing someone who's innocent. Basic intuitions of justice.
God, and you believe that the God is omnipotent and all-knowing, that even if things don't work out like you want it to, if you believe in God, you believe that he knows what he's doing. So.
But
anything God does is just.
Right, it's possible, but Avraham Avinu doesn't seem to think that here.
Yeah, see, but no one is innocent, right? And Avraham's argument, you're going to punish the innocent with the guilty, seems that was never on God's agenda, right?
Right.
Because no one was innocent.
Right.
Maybe Lot was innocent, and he gets rescued anyway, even though Avram never asks for that.
Right.
So punishing so it's like an important philosophical question about justice and theodicy, but it wasn't really germane to this situation in stone, where it seems everyone was guilty. At least it represents,
Right.
in this caricature, everyone was guilty. What Cass's reading does is really very powerful counterpoint to the earlier sources we saw where philosophy is undermines religious faith, and here it's like the philosophical question. It's not really relevant to the case at hand, but Cass is saying it's really relevant for Abraham being able to have his faith to develop.
Right.
Abraham has to go
Right.
through this process in order to cement his commitment to God in this way of seeing the world that he's started.
So I think you're right. I think it is sort of the obverse of the prior sources in the sense that some of the prior sources seem to think that if you philosophize, not only will you adhere to these wrong opinions, but you'll actually start to behave like a worse person. Right? That there's not such a difference between theory and practice, or at least theory really influences practice. But here, you have all these theoretical considerations going on, and that ends up, redounding to how Avram is going to behave in the future. And God can either behave in such a way that Avram is going to be obedient and follow him wholeheartedly and do his commandments and be righteous, or not, right? So that philosophy might actually be some sort of character building activity because of the conclusions that it leads us to. As long as it here leads us to conclude the conclusions that Judaism stipulates to be true, right? If philosophy leads you to the notion that there are two gods, then obviously Judaism's not, going to be skeptical of that.
Well, this dialogue with God, shows that there is room for thought. It's not a cut and dried,
Right.
Yes, do this, do that. That he feels that this is the kind of God, that you can, think outside the box and philosophize, but you still have to have that dialogue with a God, that philosophy
Right.
with a God.
Right. Exactly.
It seems there's a distinction between external philosophical opinions and battling them against the Christians, and then internal dialogue within our own, logic of religion. And it seems, so I think that's how you can reconcile all sources, that whenever there's an outside, don't challenge them, right? Because you're going to lose maybe because they have, a different set of
Right.
tools that we can't engage with, right?
Right.
Science, we can't win on that battle. But if we work internally and analyze our own religion philosophically, that's
Right.
conducive to understanding
So
our own religion.
maybe the difference between these sources is that Rambam does seem to think that philosophy leads to conclusions that are explicit or compatible with basic Jewish claims about the world, right? Whereas the philosopher in the Kuzari doesn't seem to think that. He thinks that if you're doing philosophy correctly, you're going to end up with the conclusion that the world is eternal. And there just doesn't seem, Rambam sort of tries to meld those two ideas together at a certain point, but basically they are incompatible, right? It seems difficult to put the two together. So the difference might just be, what are the conclusions of philosophy?
Do they exist in vastly different times, though? Is that...
What do you mean? What is Rambam's answer?
The Rambam and Yehuda Halevi.
So,
Kuzari.
how to read the Kuzari is a complicated question. It's very difficult, I think. And I, kind of like Plato, I don't know if I can honestly tell you what I think Halevi thinks about anything.
Did the Rambam and Yehuda Halevi live in vastly,
No.
concurrent?
Yeah. Rambam is a bit younger than Halevi, but I think it's well sourced that he was reading Halevi at the time, and Halevi is living in Spain at the time where Rambam is born, and then eventually moves to Egypt.
Okay, but they existed in about...
Yeah, basically contemporaries, yeah. But Rambam mentions in Moreh Nevuchim that there are three options to this question. One of them is just the simple, straightforward, the world is eternal, straightforward sort of basic reading of the first chapter of Genesis, which is that everything is created out of nothing, and then a sort of blending of the two, which is that there is a creation, but there's not nothing before the creation. Matter exists before the creation. So it's not creation out of nothing. It's still creation, and that would seem to be, at least on its face, not completely contradictory. And there's nothing before Genesis 1:1. So there's not really, but maybe we shouldn't ask what comes before. So we could go on to the last source, which is from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is the sort of foundational text in Aristotelian ethics. And if you ever read Aristotle, it's probably the first thing you would read. And it had tremendous effects in building a school of Aristotelianism and eventually influencing medieval philosophy both in the Islamic world and in the Christian world, and is enjoying a sort of renaissance now in philosophy departments with virtue ethics and Alistair MacIntyre, and it's worth a read. I think it's worth reading. But something that the basic claim of the Nicomachean Ethics is that happiness is achieved through moral virtue, and there are 13 moral virtues. So among them, courage, moderation, wit is a virtue. So if you're witty, you participate in the virtues, and the happy life consists in having all of the virtues and sort of, putting them all together, which is what justice is. So he thinks that justice is the sort of ultimate happy life until he gets to the end of the book. Right? Book 10, so that's what this is from, starts to talk about the philosophic life and the distinction between the active life, which moral virtue participates in, and the intellectual life, which the intellectual virtues participate in. So this is his, and this passage and other adjacent passages have caused a lot of ink to be spilled because it's not very clear how to reconcile this with the prior 9 books, which are about moral virtue. But if someone wants to read, Anne?
That complete happiness is a reflective kind of activity will be evident in the following two. Our belief is that the gods are blessed and happy to the highest degree. But what sorts of practical doings ought we to assign to them? Just ones? Won't they appear common, carrying on transactions, returning deposits, and everything like that? Courageous ones? Should we think of them as standing up to frightening things, facing danger because it is a fine thing to do? Everything about practical doings, if one looks through all the kind, will obviously turn out to be petty and unworthy of gods. And yet, everyone supposes them to be alive, and if alive, then in activity. If then, living has practical doing taken away from it, and still more producing, what is left except reflection? So that an activity of a god, superior as it is in blessedness, would be one of reflection, and so too the human activity that has the greatest affinity to this one will be the most productive out of happiness.
Right. So his argument is essentially human beings are kind of like the gods in the sense that we have this part of us that isn't exactly animal. The fact that we have reason and can talk about things and speak about things and reason about things is not something that the animals have, and it's sort of a divine quality, that this is really what the gods are made of. And so the question is, if that's what's going to make us really happy, then what is it that makes the gods happy? What do the gods do? If we do what the gods will do, it's unclear here whether he thinks there are many gods or one god, and let's bracket that for a second. But if we just do what the god does, that should make us happy too. So what would make a god happy? This has often been glossed as God is thinking. So like thinking as like an entity, thinking about thinking.
Oh.
Right? So if that's what would make the gods happy, shouldn't that make us happy too? So that's sort of what the contemplative life is, and he thinks that the contemplative life is essentially made up of exercising these intellectual virtues. So the intellectual virtues of theoretical wisdom, practical wisdom, and knowing yourself, and knowing about others, and knowing about metaphysics, and those sorts of things. So I think the idea here, and this idea comes up very prominently in Moreh Nevuchim, is that what you should just do is think about stuff all the time. As long as you're thinking about the right things, right? You shouldn't think about non-true things. And so if you're thinking about pigs flying, that's just not a thing to think about. It's a null set. So if you think about the true things and you contemplate them and find out more about them, that's genuinely what's going to make you happy, right? And one of those things is God, right? If God is thinking, or thinking, something like that, then that's ideally what you should be doing. That's the highest kind of activity that you can do, and it will give you the maximum amount of happiness and the maximum amount of pleasure. And so this is just sort of looking at, I think, what the prior sources are also getting onto from a different angle, maybe making a more radical claim, because obviously Avraham and other biblical figures are doing more than just thinking about God all the time. But it might be the case that that's really the most refined or the highest kind of activity, the highest kind of mitzvah that you can do. And so I guess to conclude, really what I was trying to do with this is just to say philosophy, strictly speaking, or Jewish philosophy, I won't make a claim about what it is or whether it exists, but is not obviously comfortably at home in the Jewish tradition. And yet, here's some tools, maybe if you come to the next few lectures, to think about what they're doing to capitalize on this sort of strain in the Jewish tradition and in the philosophical tradition, and why they might either confirm or deny the anti-philosophical sources.
Thank Thank you very much. Folks, come back next week for the continuation of this series.
If anyone has any more questions, we have 5 more minutes, so if anyone has questions.
Yeah.
Just a comment about blessing. I think this is a circular argument, though, because he seems to be saying that God wouldn't do things other than thinking.
Yeah.
And therefore, only thinking is godly. But he never explained, other than that one
Who
sentence.
says God's candy ice cream?
Yeah, I mean, so Aristotle's clearly not a believer in straightforward traditional Greek religion. He doesn't believe in the Homeric gods in the sense that Ares is sleeping with Aphrodite and causing wars to go one way or the other or something like that. I think he thinks that, it would be absurd to think of a god eating ice cream because gods don't have bodies and they're not, eating or enjoyment of physical things is something that is part of your animal soul, right? It's because you have a body and because you have a nutritive aspect of your person, and you have an aspect of your person that senses physical things, and that's just not what gods do. So in a certain way, in a certain way, it was kind of correct for Rambam to appropriate Aristotle because this theme is there in Aristotle, that God doesn't have a body. It sort of fits quite well. But I think the idea is just that maybe justice is a better question. Why wouldn't the gods deal justly with one another? Well, if there's one God, which seems to be the case at the end in the last sentence, how can the God deal justly with himself? That would be the question. But if there are many gods and they're perfect, which seems to be the definition of what a god would be, why wouldn't they deal justly, right? There's no happiness in doing what you have to do, right? You don't find happiness or pleasure in breathing, say. It's just what you do. You might feel displeasure if you didn't breathe, right? But it's just par for the course for you. So why would that be living well for you? Living well has to be something difficult. And it's not at all clear. I think he thinks that the gods must think well, or they must know everything. That's an open possibility here. So it very well could be circular, but I think that's what he's getting onto. What would the characteristic activity of a god be? And it does, if you notice, it does jive well also with Halevi's characterization of the Aristotelians, right? Such a god, if he doesn't care about justice, he doesn't care about you either, and you are doing justice. Mm-hmm. So there's a... Sorry?
Why creation, then?
What?
Why creation?
There's no creation.
There's no creation. For Aristotle, he's the biggest proponent of the view that the universe is eternal. Right?
So
God for him is in a section that comes right after this. He'll say God, or maybe before. He'll say God is the first mover, the prime cause. If you trace back Aristotle thinks that every effect has a cause. So if I hit the podium, it makes a sound. The sound is the effect. My hand hitting it is the cause. So if you trace back every effect to its cause, and you just keep going back and back and back and back and back, the first cause will be God. But that's not necessarily a temporal claim, right? So it's possible. You can put that with the claim that the universe is eternal. It's just that God caused everything in the universe.
could you say that the philosophers were atheists? No, you can't say.
It's possible.
About Socrates.
It's possible. I mean, Socrates probably is an atheist. Although he didn't write anything.
They do talk about gods, right?
What?
They do talk about gods.
Sure, but later in the Apology, Socrates says, "I know that you're really accusing me of being an atheist, and I'm not saying that the gods don't exist. I'm just saying I don't know anything about them." Right? So you can read into that if you want to, but he says he doesn't not believe. So if you take him at his word, but he's also a man trying to defend his life, so he might be willing to say anything. But not that he does believe in the gods. So that's also indicative. Mm-hmm. He's not willing to say that.
Right. Not anything.
Not anything. All right.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Fantastic, fantastic.